From the time she was a little girl, she would pause at the sound of a plane overhead. While other children covered their ears at the roar, she would tilt her face toward the sky, watching the silhouette cut across the clouds. Something about flight called to her, not the noise, not the spectacle, but the freedom. In her small hometown, few people ever thought beyond the horizon. Most accepted a life of routine. But for her, the sky had already whispered a promise. There is more than this. Her fascination wasn't typical for her age, nor was it encouraged. Family members smiled at her curiosity, but reminded her gently that aviation was a man's job. Teachers steered her towards safer, more suitable ambitions. Friends shrugged when she spoke of her dream. Pilots? They'd laugh. That's not for girls. The words didn't sting as much as they burned into her resolve. Every dismissal became fuel. Every laugh became a challenge. She didn't want to prove them wrong. She wanted to prove herself right. Her first steps into flight training were awkward. The cockpit was overwhelming at first glance. Dials, switches, gauges, and screens that seemed to speak a language she had yet to learn. She remembered gripping the yoke with clammy hands, her heart racing so fast she thought the instructor might hear it. But once the aircraft lifted, the ground shrinking beneath her, the panic faded. In its place came calm. The clouds didn't care about her gender. The horizon didn't laugh. Up there, she was simply a pilot. But the world below was less forgiving. Flight school was filled with confident, loud, swaggering cadets, most of them men. They competed over every landing, every maneuver, every scrap of recognition. She didn't fit into their noise. She wasn't there to boast. Instead, she studied late into the night, replaying every flight in her mind, memorizing procedures until they felt instinctive. While others went to the bar, she went to the library. While they flexed for attention, she built precision in silence. The whispers followed her everywhere. Some thought she'd drop out within weeks. Others assumed she was only there to check a box for diversity. A few were openly hostile, mocking her when she stumbled or asking pointedly if she was lost when she walked into the hangar. She answered none of it. Silence became her shield and discipline her weapon. She let her performance speak where words would have failed. One early morning, when the air was still cool and dew clung to the runway, she faced one of her toughest training flights yet, simulated engine failure. The instructor beside her had a reputation for being merciless. Most cadets panic, he warned as they lifted off. At 3,000 feet, he cut the throttle suddenly. The engine's roar died into a haunting silence. She felt her pulse leap, but her hands didn't shake. She remembered every line of procedure, every drill she'd practiced in solitude. She guided the aircraft into a controlled glide, identified a landing field, and brought it down smoothly. The instructor looked at her, eyebrows raised. For the first time, he said nothing. Moments like these piled up over time. Each one chipped away at doubt, not through dramatic victories, but through quiet consistency. She wasn't the best at everything, but when the pressure rose, she was steady. In emergencies, she didn't freeze. She didn't seek the spotlight, but the spotlight began to find her. Instructors noticed. Peers, grudgingly, began to stop underestimating her. Still, the weight of being the only one never left her. In group photos, she was always the single woman in a sea of uniforms. During physical training, she was measured against standards built for bodies different from hers. In briefings, her ideas were sometimes overlooked until a man repeated them. And yet, she endured. Not with bitterness, but with quiet resilience. She knew storms don't announce themselves. They simply arrive, and those prepared withstand them. Her parents visited once during training. They expected to find her weary, broken by the relentless pace. Instead, they found her sharper, calmer, more focused than they had ever seen. "Are you sure this is the life you want?" her mother asked quietly, worry lining her face. She answered with a steady nod. "I don't want it," she said simply. "I need it." Her mother didn't understand, but she respected it. The day she earned her wings was not marked by a roar of applause, but by a silent satisfaction deep within her chest. The pin on her uniform wasn't just a symbol of skill. It was proof that silence had power. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need to boast to be seen. The sky had accepted her, and that was enough. But the journey didn't end at graduation. If anything, it had only begun. Her assignment to combat aviation placed her in the minority once again, a lone figure among hardened warriors. She carried her same quiet determination into every briefing, every mission, every pre-flight check. When others scoffed, she smiled inwardly. They didn't know her yet. They didn't know how silence, when backed by strength, could be the loudest voice in the room. Years later, that truth would be revealed in a single unforgettable moment when a SEAL captain asked, "Any combat pilots?" And she rose, quietly, to stun them all. But that moment was only possible because of the foundation she built here in the quiet beginnings, in the nights of solitude, in the countless hours where no one watched and no one believed. For her, greatness never came with fanfare. It was forged in silence, sharpened by doubt, and lifted by an unshakable belief that the sky belongs to anyone willing to claim it. From the very beginning, the barriers had not been invisible. They were tall, thick, and at times suffocating. She knew the military's culture was not designed with her in mind. Every step she took, every room she entered, carried the weight of skepticism. She wasn't simply a pilot candidate, she was the female pilot candidate. That distinction followed her like a shadow, no matter how much she wanted to be judged on skill alone. On her first day of combat aviation training, she could feel the room tense as she entered. The chatter among the cadets dulled slightly. A few sideways glances exchanged. She was outnumbered 30-1, and the message was clear before anyone said a word. You don't belong here. The instructors weren't cruel, but they weren't indulgent either. They demanded perfection, and for her, the margin for error was razor thin. When a male cadet stumbled, it was chalked up to inexperience. When she stumbled, it was seen as proof of a stereotype. She could feel it in the silence, in the faintest sighs, in the way the notes were scribbled harder against clipboards. During one of the first classroom drills, an instructor asked for volunteers to solve a navigation problem under time pressure. A hand shot up, immediately a loud cadet, known for boasting about his test scores. He strutted to the board, solving half the problem before fumbling and freezing. The class chuckled good-naturedly. No one thought less of him. The instructor asked for another volunteer. A pause. Then, to everyone's surprise, she raised her hand. As she walked to the board, whispers followed. She's gonna mess this up. Watch this. But her chalk strokes were steady. She solved the calculation, cross-checked it twice, and presented the correct answer without hesitation. The instructor gave a curt nod of approval, nothing more. But the silence in the room afterward was different. It was heavier, sharpened with the sting of wounded pride from her peers. The resentment grew in small, unspoken ways. When groups were formed for projects, she was often the last chosen. In the mess hall, she sat alone more often than not. Some cadets avoided eye contact. Others leaned into sarcasm. Hey, maybe she flies slower so the rest of us can keep up. She never snapped back. She absorbed every comment like a stone wall absorbs the wind. But what they didn't see was the effort she poured in when no one was watching. After official training hours ended, she stayed in the simulator until midnight, running through combat scenarios again and again. She memorized checklists until she could recite them in her sleep. She studied maps, weather patterns, aircraft systems, and emergency procedures far beyond what was required. It wasn't just ambition, it was survival. She knew she couldn't afford to be average. To break through, she had to be exceptional. The physical demands were no easier. The military standard was brutal. Long-distance runs in full gear, push-ups and pull-ups until arms trembled. Obstacle courses designed to break down even the strongest bodies. For her, every run felt like running under a microscope. If she lagged, it wasn't just her weakness. It was proof that women weren't cut out for combat. That weight pressed down on her with every step, but it also pushed her forward. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs felt like lead. Slowly, she closed the gap. She began finishing not at the back, but in the middle, and sometimes even near the front. The smirks began to fade. One evening, during a grueling endurance test, the cadets were ordered to complete laps with 50-pound packs. The field was muddy from rain, and exhaustion chewed through morale. One cadet collapsed, face first in the muck, cursing that he couldn't go on. Before the instructors could react, she stopped beside him. Without a word, she hauled his pack onto her own shoulders and pulled him up by the arm. They staggered forward together, finishing the lap. She didn't expect thanks, and she didn't get it. But she had shown them something none of them could: mock strength. Gradually, grudging respect began to grow, though it was never spoken aloud. The loudest doubters quieted down, but their silence wasn't acceptance. It was acknowledgement. They couldn't deny what they had seen. She wasn't there to embarrass them. She was there to endure. And in enduring, she was teaching them that the barriers weren't hers to carry. They were theirs to dismantle. The hardest tests came not in drills, but in real flight exercises. During one aerial combat simulation, she was paired against a rival cadet who had made it clear from day one that he didn't believe she belonged in the cockpit. He called her wing decoration instead of wingwoman, sneered whenever she spoke in debriefings, and once even bet another cadet she'd wash out before the semester ended. The simulation began with him aggressively maneuvering, diving and climbing with reckless speed, trying to shake her. But she was patient. She knew that in combat, impulse was the enemy. She tracked him calmly, anticipating his turns, conserving energy until the right moment. Then, with a single decisive maneuver, she locked onto his six and held him in her sights. "Target locked," she radioed. The instructors confirmed her win. When they landed, the rival cadet stormed away, muttering under his breath. She didn't celebrate. She simply removed her helmet, wiped her brow, and carried on. Quiet victory meant more than a boastful one. Through months of this, she grew sharper. The barriers didn't vanish, but she learned to weave around them. Every slight became a stepping stone, every doubt a challenge. She didn't need to be liked, she needed to be unshakable. One night, staring at her reflection in the dormitory mirror, she allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. The face staring back at her was weary, lined with sleepless nights and endless effort. For a fleeting second, she wondered if it was worth it, if all the pain, the isolation, the constant need to prove herself was worth the dream. Then she remembered the little girl who once watched planes carve across the sky with wide-eyed wonder. That little girl deserved to see this through. The barriers remained, but she no longer saw them as walls. They were hurdles high, brutal, and unforgiving, but hurdles could be cleared. And each time she cleared one, she carried not only herself, but the possibility of others who would follow. Breaking through wasn't about shattering the system in one strike. It was about persistence, patience, and unyielding strength. It was about proving that the quietest person in the room could carry the loudest power. And she was ready, piece by piece, to claim her place in a world that had told her she didn't belong. Because belonging was never given, it was taken. And she was ready to take it. The hangar was colder than usual that morning, a kind of chill that seeped into bone and made even hardened men tighten their jackets. The sound of boots echoed against concrete as Navy SEALs filed into the room, their faces hard, their movements efficient. Each one carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been tested in the fire and walked out stronger. They were the best of the best, and they knew it. At the front of the room, a massive screen displayed satellite images of rugged terrain. The details were grainy, but enough to hint at danger. Steep ridges, shadowy valleys, and dots of enemy encampments circled in red. A low murmur ran through the room as the men studied it. They knew this wasn't going to be routine. She sat near the back, quiet as always, hands resting on her lap. Unlike the SEALs, she wasn't built like a wall of muscle, nor did she radiate the same aura of aggression. But there was something in her stillness, an intensity that didn't need to be announced. Few noticed her, and those who did dismissed her presence without a second thought. To them, she was just another support officer, maybe a tech specialist. They didn't know. Not yet. The captain entered with a kind of authority that didn't need to be shouted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by years in combat zones. The chatter ceased instantly as he strode to the front. When he spoke, his voice was steady, low, and commanding. Listen up. We've been tasked with a high-priority operation. He clicked a remote, and the screen shifted to a zoomed-in view of a compound tucked between ridges. Target is here. Intelligence confirms high-value enemy leadership on site. Extraction will not be simple. Expect heavy resistance. The men leaned forward, eyes narrowing, jaws tightening. Each one had been on missions like this before, but there was something in the captain's tone that made them understand. This one was different. We'll insert under cover of night. Team Alpha will breach the compound. Team Bravo secures perimeter and coordinates extraction. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then his eyes swept the room, sharp and calculating. For this mission, he said slowly, we'll need close air support. Someone who can keep us covered, strike with precision, and get us out if things go sideways. He let the silence stretch. Then came the question, sharp and direct. Any combat pilots here? The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy as steel. For a moment, the room froze. SEALs exchanged glances, searching for someone to rise, someone to claim the role. But no one moved. This was not a job taken lightly. The margin for error was non-existent. Whoever stepped forward would carry the lives of everyone in that room on their shoulders. At the back, she felt her heart kick once, hard against her ribs. She had known this moment would come sooner or later. The very reason she'd trained, endured, and proven herself was now here, disguised as a simple question. Her instincts screamed at her to rise immediately, but another voice whispered caution. Would they believe her? Would they trust her? Or would her presence, unacknowledged until now, be met with laughter, with dismissal? The silence thickened. Men shifted in their seats. Some smirked, others waited with subtle impatience. No one wanted to step forward, but no one expected her to. She took a breath. Then, quietly, she rose to her feet. The scrape of her chair against the floor cut through the silence like a blade. Heads turned. Eyes locked onto her. The surprise was immediate, visible in the raised brows, the quick smirks, the disbelief etched across hardened faces. A woman? Here? Standing up to a SEAL captain's call for combat pilots? She didn't flinch. The captain's gaze found her. He didn't smile, didn't frown. He simply studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly as though weighing her soul in a single glance. You? He asked. His voice wasn't mocking, but it carried the edge of skepticism. Yes, sir. Her tone was calm, steady. A chuckle came from the side. One of the SEALs leaned toward his teammate, whispering something that earned a stifled laugh. Others exchanged doubtful looks. The captain ignored them. His eyes stayed on her. Your record? This was the moment. She could feel the weight of every whisper she'd endured, every doubt cast her way. But she spoke without hesitation. 2 tours overseas, sir. 46 combat sorties. Multiple successful extractions under fire. Assisted ground teams in close quarters operations. No mission losses under my command. The room went silent again. The smirks faded. Even the chucklers fell still, the reality of her words sinking in. Numbers like that weren't fabricated. They weren't earned by accident. The captain gave a slow nod, still watching her carefully. It wasn't approval, not yet, but it was recognition. She lowered herself back into her chair, her movements as deliberate as her words. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't boasted. She had simply stated the truth. And in doing so, she had shifted the air in the room. The briefing continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The men who had dismissed her minutes earlier now stole glances in her direction, reassessing what they thought they knew. She could feel their eyes, but she kept hers locked on the screen, absorbing every detail of the mission. She wasn't there to prove herself with speeches. She would prove herself in the field. When the captain ended the briefing, the men filed out in clusters, their voices low. Some still doubted, clinging to their preconceptions. Others were curious, maybe even impressed. But one thing was certain. She was no longer invisible. And as she walked out of the hangar, her boots steady against the concrete, she knew this was only the beginning. The question had been asked, and she had answered. The next time the captain's voice echoed in that room, it wouldn't be surprise that followed her name. It would be respect. The silence after her words felt like a storm held back by glass. Every man in the room had gone still, their expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and uneasy respect. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The captain, still at the front, studied her with a gaze that seemed to pierce through skin, muscle, bone, searching for the truth behind the claim she had just made. She remained standing, her spine straight, her eyes calm, her breathing steady. Inside, her pulse thundered, but outwardly, she was unmoved. If she wavered now, if she blinked, hesitated, or faltered, everything she had fought for would collapse. A cough broke the silence. From the left side of the room, one of the younger SEALs leaned back in his chair, smirking. 46 sorties? He said, his tone dripping with doubt. That's a hell of a story. His words weren't loud, but they were sharp enough to cut through the tension. A few of the men snickered, the sound low but pointed. She didn't respond. Not yet. The captain raised a hand, silencing the chuckles instantly. His eyes never left her. Name, he said. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, sir. The title landed like a small explosion. Lieutenant Commander. Not a trainee. Not a junior officer fresh from school. A seasoned pilot with a rank that demanded acknowledgement. More than one SEAL shifted in his seat, the pieces beginning to align. 46 combat sorties, the captain repeated, his voice steady. That's not nothing. Explain. She inhaled, then spoke not quickly, not boastfully, but with the precision of someone who lived each word. First deployment, Kandahar sector. Close air support for ground convoys under hostile fire. 7 confirmed mission saves. Second deployment, northern Syria. Urban extractions, under fire from rooftop snipers and RPGs, operated in joint task force with Rangers and Delta. Logged, missions under heavy anti-aircraft fire. 0 casualties on the ground teams I supported. Her words were simple, factual. No embellishments, no theatrics. The room, filled with men who knew the cost of war, recognized the weight of what she was saying. These weren't stories you pulled from a textbook. They were scars earned through fire. For the first time since she had risen, no one smirked. The captain leaned against the table at the front, arms crossed, still evaluating her. "Why didn't I know your name before this?" "Because I don't speak unless asked, sir." Her tone was calm, almost soft, but it carried like thunder in the silence. That answer unsettled them more than any speech could have. She wasn't demanding recognition. She wasn't here to prove herself through words. She had been ready all along, waiting for the right moment not to shine, but to serve. The captain's lips twitched, almost, but not quite forming a smile. He gave a single nod. "Sit down, Lieutenant Commander." She lowered herself back into her chair, movements deliberate, her posture unshaken. Around her, the atmosphere had changed. The skepticism hadn't vanished, but it had been pierced. They couldn't dismiss her now. She wasn't a story, a symbol, or a curiosity. She was real, and her record spoke louder than their doubts. As the captain continued the briefing, she felt the weight of their gazes on her. Some looked at her with narrowed eyes, still unwilling to yield. Others regarded her with curiosity, perhaps grudging interest. And just a few looked at her with something else. Respect, not yet fully formed, but seated. The rest of the meeting passed in details. Insertion points, call signs, contingency plans. She took notes, her focus absolute, her pen moving steadily across the paper. But beneath the tactical language, the real battle was already unfolding. For years, she had prepared for this moment, not for applause, not for validation, but for the chance to stand when called. And when the captain's question rang through the room, she hadn't hesitated. She had answered, quietly but firmly. And in that silence afterward, she had shifted the balance. When the briefing ended, the men rose, chairs scraping against concrete. Groups formed quickly, voices low but intense. The mission was dangerous, and danger had a way of sobering even the boldest. She gathered her notes, slipping them into her folder, her movements as unremarkable as ever. But as she turned to leave, one of the older SEALs, a man with graying hair at the temples and scars across his knuckles, stopped beside her. He didn't smile. He didn't offer his hand. But he gave a short nod, sharp and precise, the kind soldiers gave when words were unnecessary. She returned the nod, just as brief. Nothing more passed between them. But in that simple gesture, she recognized something far greater than acceptance. Acknowledgement. Outside the hangar, the night air was cool against her face. The stars were faint behind a thin veil of clouds, the moon a pale sliver above. She walked across the tarmac, her boots steady, her mind replaying the moment over and over. The captain's voice, the silence, the decision to rise, the smirks, the nod. This was only the beginning. Tomorrow, they would go into the field, and the mission would test every skill she possessed. But for tonight, she allowed herself one quiet victory. She had stood, and she had not been broken. The moment of truth had arrived, and she had met it with silence, strength, and unshakable resolve. Respect was never handed out in rooms like these. Among Navy SEALs, respect was currency rare, heavy, and impossible to counterfeit. They didn't care for titles or speeches. What mattered was proof, scars, sweat, skill under fire. And she knew it. After the briefing, the SEALs drifted toward the exit in clusters, their boots striking concrete in rhythm. Their low voices carried fragments of doubt, the occasional chuckle, and the sharp edge of skepticism that still lingered. Though her record had silenced their laughter, it hadn't erased the years of bias etched into their bones. For some, the disbelief was harder to shake. She walked among them without hesitation, her expression calm, her shoulders square. She didn't search for approval, didn't try to catch anyone's eye. To seek respect was to weaken its value. Instead, she carried herself as though she already belonged. That, too, was part of the battle. The next morning, preparations for the mission began. Gear was checked and rechecked, weapons cleaned with meticulous care, radios calibrated. The SEALs moved with precision, each task performed almost wordlessly, as though every man had rehearsed the same silent dance 1,000 times before. She was an outlier in their formation, not handling rifles or explosives, but the maps, the flight plans, the contingency grids. Still, she worked with the same intensity. Every line she drew on the map, every adjustment she made to the timetable was calculated for their survival. She wasn't trying to impress them. She was making sure they came home alive. One SEAL, tall with a shaved head and a grin that usually came at someone else's expense, approached her as she double-checked coordinates. His tone was casual, but his words carried weight. "So," he said, 46 sorties. "You really flew all that?" She didn't look up. 47, she corrected quietly, adjusting a marker on the map. The grin faltered. He didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He just nodded once and walked away. Moments like that defined her time with them. She didn't banter, didn't defend herself, didn't counter their doubt with speeches. She answered only when needed, always with facts. And slowly, facts began to outweigh prejudice. Later that day, the captain called for a dry-run briefing. He wanted every man to walk through the plan until it became second nature. She stood at the front with him, outlining the sequence of events, explaining how air cover would respond to ground signals, how communication lines would be kept secure under fire. One SEAL interrupted. His voice was polite, but edged with challenge. "And if you're hit before extraction?" She turned to him, her gaze steady. "Then I make sure you're clear before I go down." The room went silent. It wasn't bravado, it was a statement of fact, spoken with calm certainty. She wasn't promising survival. She was promising loyalty. The SEAL who asked didn't respond. But when he sat down again, his posture had shifted. The room felt heavier, the atmosphere less dismissive, more attentive. The days that followed blurred into preparation. She ate with them, trained beside them, studied intelligence at the same long tables where jokes and jabs flew across like bullets. At first, they kept their distance. But slowly, the lines softened. During one grueling night exercise, the SEALs practiced navigation through rocky terrain. She wasn't required to join, they told her so. But she strapped on a pack anyway and followed the course. The climb was brutal, the night air sharp against lungs and muscles. Men twice her size stumbled and cursed. She never complained. She kept pace, her breath steady, her steps relentless. By the time they returned, mud clinging to their boots, no one could deny her place among them. Respect came in fragments, never in full gestures. A canteen passed her way without comment. A seat left open at the table. A nod across the hangar. Little things, small but unmistakable. And then came the turning point. During a late-night strategy session, one of the radios malfunctioned. Static crackled, drowning out the captain's instructions. A few SEALs tried to fix it, their frustration mounting as precious minutes ticked away. She moved forward silently, kneeling beside the gear. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, untangling wires, adjusting dials, recalibrating connections. Within seconds, the static cleared, the captain's voice snapping back through the line. She handed the radio back without a word. The SEAL who had struggled with it looked at her, a flash of gratitude in his eyes. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't need to. Respect was building not with fireworks, but with quiet, undeniable consistency. The captain noticed. He wasn't a man who wasted words, but his glances grew longer, more thoughtful. He had tested her with his questions in the briefing, measured her with silence. Now, he was watching something unfold, not a speech, not a challenge, but a quiet erosion of doubt. She was proving herself the only way soldiers ever truly trusted, by doing the work. On the eve of the mission, the SEALs gathered in the hangar once more. Weapons gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Packs sat lined against the wall, ready for deployment. The air was tense, every man caught in that silent storm before combat. She stood apart, adjusting her flight helmet, running her checks. One of the younger SEALs approached nervous, fidgeting, his voice low. "Hey," he muttered, almost awkward. "You got us covered tomorrow, right?" She fastened the strap under her chin, then met his eyes. "Always." It wasn't a reassurance. It was a promise. And in that moment, the final layer of skepticism cracked. Respect had not been given to her. It had been wrestled from silence, from sweat, from relentless proof that she would not bend. When they boarded the transport that night, the SEALs no longer looked past her. They looked at her. Not as a guest, not as a curiosity, but as one of them. And though no one said it aloud, every man in that room carried the same unspoken thought. If they had to trust their lives to someone in the sky, they could trust them to her. The hum of the transport plane was a steady thunder in their ears, vibrating through steel, flesh, and bone. Inside, the SEALs sat in silence, each man lost in thought. The night sky outside the fuselage stretched dark and endless, broken only by the occasional shimmer of starlight. She sat near the cockpit, helmet secured, eyes fixed on the mission maps displayed on the screen before her. Every detail had been memorized, every contingency rehearsed, but she went over it again. Not because she doubted herself, but because doubt in her position could cost them their lives. The captain stood, steady even as the plane rattled in turbulence. His voice cut through the drone of the engines. "We go in fast, we go in quiet. Reynolds, you'll be eyes in the sky. We'll signal when extraction begins. Until then, keep the skies clean." She nodded once. No speech, no bravado. Just readiness. The red light above the hatch began to blink. Seconds later, the green glow followed. The SEALs rose in unison, their gear clattering softly as they moved to the open door. The night wind roared in, cold and merciless. One by one, shadows leapt into the abyss, parachutes deploying in silent bursts. She watched them vanish into the dark before turning to her own task. Minutes later, her boots hit the tarmac of a forward operating base. From there, she sprinted to her aircraft, a modified combat helicopter, armored, armed, sleek as a predator in the night. Sliding into the pilot's seat, she strapped in, her hands moving over switches and dials with effortless precision. The engines roared to life. Above her, the blades churned the night air into a violent storm. She lifted off, climbing into the black sky, her machine merging with the shadows. Below, the SEALs infiltrated enemy territory. Their target, a fortified compound where hostages were believed to be held. It was a high-value extraction, one laced with danger. They would move fast, breach silently, and exfiltrate before reinforcements could arrive. That was the plan. But war rarely obeyed plans. As they breached the compound, gunfire erupted short, controlled bursts at first, and escalating into a storm of chaos. The SEALs pushed forward, methodical, efficient, their movements honed from years of training. Overhead, she circled, her eyes scanning the terrain, sensors feeding her information in real time. "Hostile vehicles approaching from the east," she reported over comms, her voice calm, steady. "Copy that," the captain replied. No hesitation, no wasted words. She adjusted her trajectory, dipping low over a ridge. The approaching vehicles came into view, trucks armed with heavy machine guns, headlights cutting through the dark. She flipped the safety off her weapons, her fingers tightening on the controls. Engaging. The sky split with fire. Rockets screamed downward, striking the lead vehicle. An eruption of flame lit the night, metal twisting in the blast. The remaining trucks swerved, brakes screeching, men scrambling for cover. She followed with precise bursts from her cannons, disabling engines, scattering enemies. On the ground, the SEALs advanced, the compound shaking with explosions. Overcomes, their voices cut in short, clipped reports. Hostages secured, moving to extraction. But enemy reinforcements were fast. From the west, more vehicles approached. From the compound's perimeter, hostile fighters poured in, their gunfire lighting the night like a storm of sparks. "Reynolds, we're pinned." One of the SEALs barked. She banked sharply, her helicopter tilting at a punishing angle. Through the cockpit glass, she saw them, a cluster of SEALs pressed against a wall, gunfire raining down from rooftops and alleys. Without hesitation, she dove low, bringing her craft within striking distance. Her cannons roared, shredding enemy positions with deadly accuracy. Brick walls crumbled, gunfire faltered. "Move now," she commanded Overcomes. Her voice was steel, unyielding. The SEALs surged forward, using the cover she provided. Hostages clung to their protectors as they sprinted toward the extraction point. Bullets whizzed past, grenades detonated, but the path was clearing because she had carved it with fire. Then, a sharp crack rattled her cockpit. Warning lights flashed. One of her rotors had been clipped by enemy fire. The machine shuddered, alarms blaring. For a split second, her pulse spiked. But panic had no place here. She gritted her teeth, forced her hands steady. The bird was wounded, but it wasn't grounded. Not yet. "Taking fire," she reported, voice even despite the chaos. Still operational, she dipped again, firing her last barrage of rockets at a rooftop sniper nest that had pinned the SEALs down. The explosion lit the night, sending debris raining into the streets. "Extraction point secured," the captain's voice came through, sharp and decisive. She swung her helicopter around, landing hard on the designated zone, rotors thrashing dust and debris into a whirlwind. The SEALs appeared seconds later, hostages in tow, sprinting toward the aircraft. One by one, they piled in, shouting over the roar of engines. The captain was last. As he climbed aboard, he locked eyes with her for a split second. In that look, there was no doubt, no skepticism, only trust. "Go," he barked. She pulled the controls, the bird groaning under the strain, the damaged rotor fighting against her. But she coaxed it upward, muscles taut, eyes unblinking. Slowly, painfully, the aircraft lifted, rising above the smoke and fire below. Enemy gunfire chased them, tracers streaking the night sky. She weaved, dodged, pushed her machine to its limits. Every second felt like an eternity, every bullet a whisper of death. But she never faltered. Finally, the ground fire began to fade, the compound shrinking into the distance. A black sky opened ahead, vast and silent once more. The danger wasn't gone, but they had broken free. Inside the cabin, the SEALs sat in exhausted silence, their chests heaving, their weapons still in hand. The hostages huddled together, wide-eyed but alive. And at the front, hands firm on the controls, she flew them all to safety. The trial by fire had come, and she had carried them through. When they finally touched down at base, the SEALs filed out, battered but unbroken. The captain lingered, stepping close to her cockpit. He didn't say much, he never did. But his words, simple and sharp, cut deeper than any speech. "You kept us alive." For the first time, his tone wasn't testing, wasn't skeptical. It was respect earned the only way it ever could be. She removed her helmet, sweat plastering strands of hair to her forehead. She looked him in the eye and nodded once. Nothing more needed to be said. That night, for the first time, the SEALs didn't just see her as a pilot. They saw her as one of them. The base was quieter than usual that night, but not silent. Victory never came without scars, and the air still carried the weight of what they had endured. The compound raid was over, the hostages safe, and the team intact. Yet the memory of chaos lingered, gunfire echoing in ears, the smell of smoke clinging to fatigues, the unshakable feeling of danger too close. For her, the sound of the damaged rotor blades still rang in her bones. She had felt every tremor of the helicopter, every warning light screaming that the bird might not make it home. And yet, they had landed. They had lived. When she stepped out of the cockpit, sweat-drenched and weary, she expected to be invisible again, an outsider who had simply done her job. But instead, something happened she hadn't anticipated. The SEALs waited. Not all of them. Some were too exhausted, too consumed by their own thoughts, but enough stood in the hangar to mark the moment. They didn't speak, not at first. They simply watched her as she removed her helmet, setting it gently against the fuselage. Their gazes carried no mockery, no skepticism. What she saw instead was recognition, the kind born from shared fire. A captain broke the silence. He stood with his arms crossed, face unreadable, but his voice carried. You held that bird together when any other pilot would have gone down. It wasn't flattery. It wasn't praise. It was fact, spoken in the way soldiers honored each other, truth without decoration. She met his gaze, nodded once. You kept your men alive. I just did my part. The captain's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. You'll fit in just fine. The words echoed louder than any applause. In the days that followed, the story spread. Not through official reports, though those too praised her performance, but through the informal channels that mattered more. Around mess tables, in gyms, across the barracks, her name began to surface. Not in whispers of doubt, but in tones of grudging admiration. You hear what she did in that compound? Kept the bird in the air after taking a hit. Got him all out alive. Hell of a pilot. Hell of a backbone. The SEALs weren't men who offered compliments freely. But respect, once earned, carried further than any title. And soon, even those who had mocked her presence at the first briefing began to view her differently. One afternoon, as she ran drills in the simulator, a SEAL she had barely spoken to approached. He was broad-shouldered, his jaw lined with scars, his reputation whispered in stories of firefights across the globe. You flew for us, he said simply. That counts. It was the closest thing to a thank you she would ever receive from him. She responded in kind, with a short nod, no words. That was enough. Her bond with the team didn't form in grand gestures. It was built in quiet moments. A water bottle slid across the table during debrief. A seat saved in the crowded mess hall. A joke tossed her way, not sharp with mockery, but soft with inclusion. Each small act was a stone laid in the foundation of something greater, trust. But the mission had forged more than camaraderie. It had carved a place for her in their history. The SEALs measured legacy not in medals or citations, but in stories that outlived missions. And her story was already becoming one of those. At night, when she sat alone in her quarters, she thought about what had changed. Not just for them, but for her. For years, she had carried the weight of proving herself, of standing silent while the world doubted. The mission had not erased the years of struggle, but it had shifted something within her. For the first time, she wasn't fighting to be seen. She was simply part of the fight. She thought back to the moment in the briefing when the captain had asked, "Any combat pilots?" and how she had stood. That choice, small as it seemed, had changed everything. It had opened the door to the fire that would forge her legacy. 2 weeks later, the team gathered for another assignment. This time, when she entered the room, no silence greeted her. Instead, the SEALs nodded in acknowledgement, some muttering greetings, others clearing space for her at the table. It wasn't friendship, not yet. Friendship came later, slower, in years and wars. But it was respect. And in their world, respect was rarer than gold. The captain began the briefing, voice steady as ever. He laid out the objectives, the risks, the stakes. When he paused to ask, "Any questions?" one of the SEALs glanced her way. She met his eyes briefly, then returned to her notes. She didn't need to speak. Her presence, steady and unyielding, was answer enough. This time, no one doubted she belonged there. That night, she walked across the tarmac, the air cool and clear. Stars stretched wide above, silent witnesses to her journey. She paused beside her aircraft, running a hand across the metal hull scarred from battle. Each dent, each burn mark, told a story, a reminder of the trial they had survived. Legacy wasn't something you claimed. It was something etched into you by fire, by danger, by the eyes of those who had seen you at your truest. She knew her legacy wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to the team she had flown for, the lives she had saved, the respect she had earned without demanding it. And though many battles lay ahead, one truth was already clear. She had stepped into the silence, faced their doubt, and emerged with something no one could take away. A place in their story. For the SEALs, she would always be the pilot who had answered quietly when asked, the one who had stunned them not with words, but with resolve. And for herself, she carried the knowledge that her silence, her strength, and her fire had forged not only respect but legacy. The sun had barely risen, spilling muted light across the tarmac. Dew clung to the grass at the edges of the base, glinting faintly like shards of glass in the morning haze. She stood beside her helicopter, helmet in hand, the cool metal beneath her fingers, grounding her in the reality of a world she had fought hard to inhabit. This was the calm after fire, the stillness following chaos. It was a strange moment for someone like her, accustomed to the roar of engines, the staccato rhythm of gunfire, the pulse of adrenaline that came with every mission. But even in quiet, the weight of what she had endured pressed down gently, insistently. For years she had trained, endured whispers, faced doubt, and survived isolation. She had learned that respect could not be asked for, and that validation rarely arrived in words. It was earned sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, and always under pressure. And now, years after that first moment in the briefing, when a SEAL captain had asked, "Any combat pilots?" she could see the cumulative weight of her journey reflected in the faces of those she served with. They didn't treat her differently because she was a woman. They treated her differently because she had proven over and over that she belonged. She carried that knowledge with her like armor, lighter than doubt, but heavier than fear. Her thoughts drifted to the missions that had shaped her, the sorties under fire, the close air support in hostile territory, the nights spent in simulators long after everyone else had left. Each mission had been a lesson, a test, a crucible forging not only skill but character. Each life saved, each ground team pulled from harm's way, added to a ledger that no one would see but those who lived to tell it. The SEALs began to gather around the aircraft, their movements casual but deliberate. There was no chatter of skepticism here, no hidden doubts, no sideways glances. Just soldiers preparing for another mission, another day in a life defined by danger, loyalty, and courage. And in their midst, she had found her place, not merely tolerated, not merely noticed, but trusted, relied upon, and respected. One of the younger seals, the same who had nervously asked her if she had them covered weeks before, approached. He carried a bundle of Kun's equipment, checking it nervously under the early light. He paused beside her, glanced up at the sky, then met her eyes. "You saved my life," he said quietly, not as a statement of gratitude alone, but as acknowledgement of the bond forged in fire. She didn't need to respond. The nod she gave was enough. In that simple motion, decades of doubt, effort, and endurance coalesced into something visible, mutual trust. The captain emerged from the hangar, his silhouette sharp against the lightening sky. He walked beside her, words measured, his tone holding the weight of command, but also something rarer, approval. "Your record precedes you," he said. "Not just your skill, but your judgment. That's what counts in combat. That's what keeps people alive." She met his gaze, feeling the truth in it. Judgment under pressure, calm amidst chaos, the ability to remain silent until action demanded otherwise. These were her tools, her language, her method, and in the eyes of those who had tested her, they had finally understood. She remembered again that first briefing, the doubt in the room, the unspoken assumptions that she wouldn't measure up. She had risen anyway. That choice, simple, quiet, unassuming, had become the first link in a chain that led her here. It had carried her through trials, missions, and moments that would define her life. The morning passed with preparation for the next assignment. Maps were studied, coordinates double-checked, and equipment inspected. She moved through it all methodically, quietly asserting her presence not through words, but through competence, precision, and readiness. Her mind wandered briefly, imagining the countless women who would come after her, those who might now see a path previously barred. She had not taken her place for them, but she had left a door, open a doorway created by enduring, proving, and standing quietly when the world expected her to step aside. Legacy was rarely about recognition. It was about impact, the unseen influence carried forward by courage and consistency. As the team moved toward the helicopters for deployment, she noticed the subtle gestures that had become part of their culture. A hand on her shoulder as she climbed aboard, a helmet adjusted without words, seats left open beside her. These were quiet acknowledgments, but for her, they were louder than any award or citation. They spoke of trust forged in danger, respect won in silence, and unity built through shared experience. The rotors lifted her into the sky, and the world below fell away. Cities and rivers, mountains and valleys, stretched endlessly beneath her, indifferent and eternal. And in that moment, she felt both infinitesimal and immense small against the vastness of the earth, yet vast in her own right because of what she had endured, accomplished, and earned. The mission ahead would demand everything of them once again. Danger was never far, and the line between life and death was always razor thin. But she was ready. Not for recognition, not for glory, not for words. She was ready because this was her place, and she had claimed it through every sacrifice, every quiet decision, every calculated risk. Back at base, as the sun climbed higher, she glanced at the team. They were preparing, moving with the familiarity of soldiers who had been tested and trusted. Their eyes occasionally flicked toward her, not out of doubt, not out of curiosity, but with the assurance that comes from knowing she would always be where she was needed, ready to act with precision and courage. For her, this was the ultimate measure of success. Not medals, not headlines, not accolades. It was the knowledge that she had carved her path in a world designed to overlook her, that she had faced doubt, danger, and disbelief, and emerged not merely intact, but respected, relied upon, and remembered. And in that quiet triumph, she understood something deeper. Legacy wasn't the applause of others. It was the unseen chapter, written in the lives she had touched, the lives she had saved, and the doors she had opened. For those who would follow, her story would serve as proof that courage, endurance, and quiet determination could carve a place where none was offered. The wind swept across the tarmac, tugging at her uniform, tousling her hair. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sunlight warm her face. The helicopter hummed beneath her, ready for the next mission, the next challenge. But for now, she allowed herself to breathe, to reflect, to acknowledge the journey that had brought her here. She had risen quietly when asked. She had flown through fire. She had earned the respect that no words could give. And she had forged a legacy that would endure in ways she might never fully see. The unseen chapter was written, not in headlines, not in speeches, but in the moments that mattered most, the split-second choices, the quiet courage, and the unwavering resolve to stand when it counted. And as the first full light of day touched the base, she stepped forward, ready to continue, ready to lead, ready to soar unseen, unbroken, and unforgettable.